Welcome, everybody. Vitayamo. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are. I see a lot of repeat offenders here, familiar faces, familiar names, and lots of newcomers. Tonight, we have a very, very exciting discussion and a very prominent speaker with us. So we're delighted today to present to you Seth Stodder. Our focus today is the Russia-Ukraine war, refugees, internally displaced people, and human rights. Seth Stodder is currently in the law faculty at University of Southern California, and he is the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security for Borders, Immigration, and Trade in the Obama administration. He is currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council of the United States, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a sustaining member of the Pacific Council on International Policy and the Truman National Security Project. He serves on the advisory board for the International Summit on Borders. He has been a German Marshall Fund Memorial Fellow in 2008 and serves on the German Marshall Fund Alumni Leadership Council. He's a member of the U.S. Supreme Court Bar and the California Bar. He holds a BA in history from Haverford College and his JD from University of Southern California Law School. So without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Seth Stodder. And please do feel free to post questions or thoughts in the chat as we go. We will have time towards the end for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and hopefully people can hear me okay. Greetings to you all from Southern California. I would say sunny Southern California, but it's not quite sunny this morning. And by the way, it's the morning here. It's about 9 o'clock in the morning here in Southern California. So, but thank you to Jessica, thank you to Maria, to everybody at Fulbright Ukraine, and also at the Institute of International Education for inviting me to speak. And thank you, Jessica, for the introduction. And I'm not nearly as prominent as you might think, or as you say. But thank you. I appreciate the introduction. I'm really thrilled to do this talk. I think the issues that obviously that Ukraine is facing, and Europe is facing, the world is facing, with regard to the war, and then the crisis with regard to refugees and internally displaced people, is sort of at the heart. In some ways, it's become at the heart of the war. In some ways, and so what I want to talk about today, and here I am. I think first thing I'll say is, what I'm not going to talk about so much, or I could talk about, but I don't feel worthy to talk about so much, in the sense of here I am in sunny Southern California, a long ways away, as an American. And yes, I've been to Kyiv and I've been to Warsaw and various places, but I'm by no means an expert on the everyday struggles of what's going on the ground. Other than what I read in the newspapers, and I'm an informed person, but I'm going to talk more from the big picture conceptual level, in terms of how I see the key issues that are going on, and sort of where we as a international community need to be focused in terms of how we get through the next year or so of this brutal conflict that is lasting longer than I think anybody would have anticipated. But it's like every conflict. It's once the Pandora's box of war is opened, no one can predict how long it's going to go or what's going to happen, and the horrors that can flow. There's plenty. I'm thinking of Maria and her study of American history. I'm thinking of like the second inaugural address of Abraham Lincoln, talking about the U.S. Civil War, and how sort of once the war started, nobody could have understood or predicted the enormous things that would happen from it. And I'm mangling the second inaugural is one of the great addresses in American history, but I'm reminded of it as I think about sort of what's going on in the war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, and the consequences of that war going forward. I have also the other things I guess I would mention in terms of introduction on me is just enormous affection for the people of Ukraine. I've been to Ukraine only once, but I mean, it was with the German Marshall Fund. Not in my fellowship, but with several friends, in a conference. Actually, took place several years ago about, interestingly enough, about the future of democracy, and it was in Kyiv. And I just remember just feeling this sense of just emotionally overwhelmed. Not by, I mean, I took I was taken on a tour of the Maidan Square and seen the memorials to people who fought for freedom in the revolution a few years ago against. But what was most moving to me was just wandering around the square after seeing it and just seeing people pushing their children and living normal lives and drinking coffee. And it's sort of, in some ways it reminds me, again, thinking of the American context, of kind of what Thomas Jefferson said about the pursuit of happiness, and that's the ultimate freedom I think people would have, is the right to choose to live in happiness and live an ordinary life if they want to. And this is exactly what Vladimir Putin and his cruise missiles and his threats of nuclear war and all that are trying to deprive of the people of Ukraine. And that's why the people of the United States and of Europe and others are standing with Ukraine as much as we possibly can. I guess what I want to talk about is, as I say, I think it's important to talk about this issue of the refugee crisis and the crisis of the internally displaced right now, because I think this war, in so many different ways, is at an inflection point. Because I think we're seeing that. I mean, the key inflection point that I'm seeing here, and I think many in the world are seeing, is that at a very fundamental level, this invasion of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin and the Russian army has been a disaster to Russia. And it's been, obviously, thousands of Russian soldiers have been killed in Ukraine. And the facts on the ground, at least right now, and knock on, I can't find any wood near me, but I'll knock on my head as my father used to do. It seems like that the Ukrainian army is gradually and almost inexorably taking back land that has been occupied by the Russian army, certainly in the east, and also gradually, slowly in Kherson and other places. So Russia is obviously facing serious battlefield reverses, and it has called up people from conscripts into the Russian army that are not sufficiently trained and do not have the kind of morale that could conceivably win a war. So that's it seems to be the situation right now on the ground. Obviously, things can change and the tide can move one way or the other. But right now, it seems like the facts of the war is that Russia is gradually losing this war. And so it seems now that Putin's key strategy is to take the war to the Ukrainian people. And the true center of gravity of the war now, I think, is there are two centers of gravity. One is three: the Russian people and the Russian morale as to whether Putin's regime can survive. But the centers of gravity I'd like to talk about here today would be the Ukrainian people, in terms of as Maria would say, the resilience of the Ukrainian people, not just, certainly the people who are in place, but also the internally displaced and the refugee populations that have moved outside Ukraine. But also, I think the other center of gravity is the morale and cohesion of the West, including the United States and Western Europe, in terms of whether we will continue to support Ukraine in a united and forceful way to defend against the Russian invasion. And I think Putin sees those two things as his two centers of gravity in the war. And so if one kind of thinks about that conceptually and from a strategic point of view, the refugee issue and the internally displaced issue is not only an important human rights issue and an important issue, just a human, just the heartbreaking suffering of Ukrainian people, but it's also very much a strategic political issue that is at the center of the war, I think, right now. It's a battle of, as I say, it's a battle of hearts and minds and a battle of morale, of not just the troops on the ground, but also of the Ukrainian people and the West and the people of the West as well. So now, before I go on, I see there are questions in the chat. I think probably what I'm probably going to try to do is talk. I'm a law professor, so left to my own devices, and I've been a politician in the past. Left to my own devices, I could probably talk for the rest of your natural lives. I'm going to try not to do that. I'm going to try to just give kind of an overview, and then hopefully we'll have enough time left for some good question and answer, because I'd love to have some dialogue. Because as I say, I may be kind of an expert on big picture global relations, and from an American point of view, obviously far away. but I'm no expert of what's going on actually on the ground. And I would count on people on this call actually to fill me in and tell me I'm all wet, if I am all wet in my perception of things. But I'll talk for a bit. So it seems like Putin's strategy right now, I think with regard to that center of gravity, and from my perception, is this a three-part strategy. And one part of the strategy is essentially ethnic cleansing and to depopulate Ukraine as much as possible. And you can see that obviously in the brutality in places like Bucha and the other occupied areas where, and now as the Ukrainian forces are rolling back the Russian occupation, we're seeing in almost every small village, every city, mass graves, evidence of sexual violence, and any number of other things that the Russian army has been doing to terrorize the Ukrainian public. And then also, I think to essentially, and also, of course, with the forced deportations to Russia of perhaps as much as 1 million people, 1.5 million people to Russia, and forced orphaning of children, and among other things. But also, I think in trying to spark a refugee crisis to move people out of Ukraine and cripple Ukraine's economy by depriving it of its young people and its best and the brightest, and its women and children, its next generation, trying to drive them out of the country. So that's clearly a piece of Putin's strategy. Second piece of the strategy, I think clearly, as it's being revealed right now, is to terrorize the Ukrainian people, especially as winter is coming. Terrorize people, make people less confident of their security in their homes, in cities like Kyiv and in western cities in western Ukraine, and also try to cripple Ukraine's infrastructure, power infrastructure, energy infrastructure, water infrastructure, and other things in advance of the winter coming. And so clearly, and the effort to terrorize the Ukrainian people, the point of that, presumably from Putin's point of view, is to try to convince the Ukrainian people from a morale perspective to say to President Zelensky that, okay, it's time for negotiations. It's time to give Putin a face-saving way out of this disastrous war that will keep Putin in power, that will allow him to claim some territorial gains from the war, some reason for the tens of thousands of Russian troops who have lost their lives and tens of thousands more who've been grievously wounded, and the damage to the Russian economy. Some face-saving way of saying, yeah, this was a good idea. I'm glad we did this and we've won the war. So I think the effort to terrorize the Ukrainian population is trying to do that. I mean, thinking back to American history again, it's like, in some ways, it's like Nixon and Kissinger with the saturation bombing of North Vietnam to try to convince the North Vietnamese, all right, we got to come to the table, give the United States a face-saving way of getting out. I think this is Putin's strategy. It's a Nixon-Kissinger strategy, terrorizing the Ukrainian people and also even threatening even more terror, including potentially the use of nuclear weapons or the use of dirty bombs, in some way to sort of break the morale of the Ukrainian people and force Zelensky to come to the negotiating table. And then the last thing, I think Putin is seeing third part of the strategy is to break the will of the West, and you can see this through the effort to increase energy costs, and which have close to tripled in some parts of the West, to keep inflation very high. The Eurozone's inflation rate is around 10%. Poland's is close to 20%. Czech Republic is close to 20%, and making life as miserable as possible for people in Western Europe. And then also as part of that, to spark a renewed refugee crisis, not only in terms of keeping people who are currently in Western Europe and overtaxing resources and all that, but also to spark more people from moving to move west and further tax Western resources, Western schools, Western healthcare, and Western cohesion, and really fundamentally to exhaust the sort of create sufficient fatigue in Western Europe and also in the United States, to sort of lose support for the war, and we see, and I think that's fundamentally a political strategy. You can see, what's the classic line from Clausewitz, that war is politics by other means, and the same thing is true on the reverse side, in the sense of, and you can see it, and it's a political strategy. I mean, I try not to be partisan. I'm probably more on the Democratic side here in the United States, but I did serve in the Bush administration as well, so I've served Republican and Democratic presidents. But you can see it in the political campaign here in the United States with, I think, some of the Republican candidates, including Kevin McCarthy, who's the likely next speaker maybe the next speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, saying that U.S. aid to Ukraine is going to come under greater scrutiny when the Republicans take power in the Congress. And you can see Senate candidates like J.D. Vance saying, I don't care about the Ukrainians, I care about the southern border with Mexico and the Venezuelans and the others coming to our border. Why should I care about Ukrainian refugees when I need to deal with building a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border? So you can see kind of the Trump America First sort of piece of the Republican Party, the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, I think seeing it's a moment conceivably to steer U.S. policy on Russia, Ukraine in a different direction. And I think also you're seeing this a little bit with the rise of the far-right movements or the continued rise of far-right movements in Europe, and the victory of the far-right in Sweden, the victory of the far-right in Italy. And now the question that remains to be seen is whether that victory of the far-right in some of the countries in Europe is actually pro-Putin far-right. It seems like the Italian prime minister is not pro-Putin, is still maintaining support for Ukraine. And I was looking at a recent Pew research study of far-right followers in Europe, and the support for Putin among the far-right has dropped significantly in Europe. So Putin may be surprised by that, but I think it's clearly part of the strategy is essentially to drive lack of cohesion in the West. So, and it's coming at a challenging time when obviously Europe is facing economic challenges, not only the energy costs and inflation, but then also the global rise in interest rates. I mean, we just had another significant rise by the Federal Reserve here in the United States that's trying to control inflation, but that many people are predicting is going to drive the world into a global recession starting in 2023, which will put further pressure on the political parties of Europe as well as in the United States. And because certainly the more economic reverses that you see, the more power populists tend to have. And it could be far-right populists that undermine support in the West for the war in Ukraine and start saying, well, hey, we got people out of work here in the United States or out of work in London or other places. Why are we giving so much money and so much material to the Ukrainians when we need to give money, that kind of support to people back home? And that becomes a political argument. And that's what Putin is counting on. So, okay, so that's by way of introduction, thinking about what Putin's strategy here is, I think. So, and the central nature of, and how the Ukrainian people and this refugee crisis is central to where this war is going to go, I think. So now, so in that sense, the reason why I want to give this talk is also to kind of give sort of a level set, I think, of the big picture of kind of where I think that refugee crisis really stands in the United States. I mean, for people who are watching from the US or also from Western Europe or other places, to sort of get a sense of where we are. So big picture thinking. So Filippo Grandi, the head of the UN, or the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, was just on a Western program or US program, the NewsHour, talking about the refugee crisis in the context of broader worldwide refugee crises. And the numbers seem to be, there's some fudge in these numbers, but the numbers are about 14 million Ukrainians, plus or minus, have been forcibly displaced by the war. And if you think about it, it's sort of a shocking thought. The Ukrainian population before the war was about 44 million people. So we're talking about a third of the population of Ukraine that has been forcibly displaced by this war. And this doesn't count also the millions more people who have not been forcibly displaced, but are essentially trapped where they are in substandard housing and other places. So the personal crisis at the human level cannot be understated with regard to the war in Ukraine. Now, coming again back to basic numbers here, of the 14 million, about half of that population, and it wavers between 6 million to 7 million, depending on the month, depending on the flows across the Ukrainian-Polish border and other places, are internally displaced within Ukraine, with large concentrations of internally displaced people who are displaced from the conflict areas, especially in the south and in the east, and who are living in places like Lviv, as well as Kyiv and other places, mostly in the west, away from the conflict. And so that's nearly half of that population. And of course, the issues, the challenges of that, the International Organization for Migration had a survey that they took before the recent attacks on critical infrastructure by Putin, released at the end of August, that was said that 22% of the internally displaced people inside Ukraine, housing stock is totally inadequate for the winter. And that was 22% as of the end of August. And this is before the attacks on housing, the attacks on water infrastructure, the attacks on power and energy infrastructure over the last 2 months. So that number is clearly higher now. So we are facing kind of an immediate crisis of people inside Ukraine who lack basic housing to deal with an incredibly harsh winter. So that is an immediate crisis. Also, and this is a report again from the IOM in late August, 30% of the Ukrainian internally displaced population lack access to adequate medical care. And that number surely is higher now after the attacks on civilian infrastructure. So there are crucial needs right now with the internally displaced people inside Ukraine for adequate shelter, adequate warmth for the winter. Also cash, just literally in the sense that the impact on the Ukrainian economy of this war is not to be understated from the perspective of the collapse of employment inside Ukraine, and also rising inflation rates. I think the last I saw the inflation rate, the official inflation rate in Ukraine is around 25%, which certainly puts the we think about the political battles in the United States over 8% inflation here, and how that is hammering Biden's popularity. Well, try 25%, and that's just the official inflation rate. The real inflation rate probably is much higher, and so I think there's a concern about hyperinflation as a prospect for that within Ukraine. So cash is an enormous need, and the ability to actually pay for everyday goods and services within Ukraine. So that is the situation of the internally displaced people in Ukraine is certainly dire and needs elevated attention in the West to handle that. Then the flip side is the other 7 million of the displaced people who have become refugees. Now, in thinking about that number, that number is a tough figure to think about, because 2.8 million of that 7 million are people who are in Russia, who are Ukrainians, who are deemed refugees or seen as refugees in the statistics in Russia. But we know, of course, that a huge proportion of that 2.8 million, some of those people obviously were trapped by the war and have moved across the border into Russia, and small numbers into Belarus as well. But a huge percentage, conceivably up to 1.5 million, are people who have been forcibly relocated from Russian occupied areas in Ukraine as part of what I said before, one of Putin's 3 key strategies here, which is to depopulate Ukraine and demoralize and terrorize the Ukrainian people. So, and that in and of itself, I mean, is a textbook human rights violation, in violation of the Geneva Conventions, and a war crime. So moving and the brutality of those forced relocations. I mean, this is the stories of moving people through filtration camps, and strip searching people to determine if people have nationalistic tattoos, and then identifying men, especially, who are conceivably a threat to Russia, and executing them on the spot, and forcibly orphaning children and giving children essentially up for adoption to Russian families, never to be seen again. I mean, the types of human rights violations that Russia is committing in the context of these forcible relocations as part of the refugee numbers, I think, again, not to be underestimated, the impact of that and the scale of that. And you look at that combined with the mass graves that we've seen in Bucha and other places that have been occupied by the Russian army, you can see this is a piece of the Russian strategy here in terms of terrorizing and depopulating the Ukraine. Now, 4.8 million plus or minus have moved into Western European countries. And this is a fluid number because the UNHCR is estimating at least 3.1 million or so Ukrainians have gone back into Ukraine after coming initially to Western Europe. And you can see, again, this is part of Putin's strategy in the sense of the relative calm that we saw in Western Ukrainian cities in the summer, as the focus of the battle was very much in the south and the east. I think gave people a sort of a false sense of security in the sense that they could move back and come back. And now here, with again Putin's and Russian forces on the defensive in the south and the east, Putin has now resumed the fight and escalated the fight into Ukrainian cities and terrorizing the population. So the question here is whether many of the people who have moved back into Ukraine from Western Europe are now going to reverse direction and head back into Western Europe, and we'll see. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But and or become internally displaced within Ukraine and leaving their homes that are now under attack again. So roughly 4.2, 4.3 million now have registered for temporary protection in Europe. And this is under the European Union's temporary protection directive that was enacted in 2001 after the Balkan Wars. This was first time this has been actually activated. So this was activated by the European Union on March 2nd of 2022, shortly after the February invasion by Russia. And essentially the temporary protection directive allows Ukrainian refugees to bypass the complicated asylum rules of the European Union. So people aren't going to have to apply individually for asylum and all of that process. And so people were able to, under the temporary protection directive, get immediate support and immediate shelter, including access to healthcare, access to education, access to jobs, work authorization, among other things, and some, and depending on the country and the community, some monetary support. And roughly 4.2, 4.3 million are registered under the European Union's temporary protection directive. And I'll pause there also. I mean, as horrific as this whole crisis has been for the Ukrainian people and for the people of Europe, it is the one silver lining here, and certainly I saw this when I was in Warsaw earlier this year a few times, is it's fortuitous that this crisis is happening on the border of the European Union in the context of other crises. If you think about it, in just this year, about 850,000 Ethiopians have had to leave their homes, been forcibly displaced by the conflict in northern Ethiopia. 500,000 people in Myanmar have been forcibly displaced by the armed resistance against the military regime in Myanmar. And that's over and above the million or so Rohingya refugees that are still in Bangladesh in camps, huge refugee camps like Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. And then also you can think about the other huge movements of people over the last few years, including from the Congo, the long conflict in the Congo, the diaspora of Venezuelans here in the Western Hemisphere, also the Syrian and Afghanistan refugee crises in Iraq, and the crisis in the Sahel in Africa. So the one silver lining of this horrific crisis is that it's taking place on the border of the European Union, where there are resources in the European Union to help people who are coming across. Now, where in Europe are refugees right now? Poland is number one on the list, about 1.4 million people registered under the temporary protection directive in Poland. In Poland, it's interesting. Certainly Poland has had its challenges with regard to immigrants from other nationalities, whether it be Afghans or Roma or Iraqis or others, and we saw that in the crisis last year when Belarus was pushing many migrants from the Middle East across the Polish border, and you saw a Polish army using water cannons to try to keep these refugees from Afghanistan and Iraq and other places out of Poland. And certainly the political push of the Polish government currently has not necessarily, before this crisis, been favorably disposed towards immigrants. However, the Ukrainian crisis, I think, has been the exception to that rule, because Poland, I think, has been extraordinarily welcoming to Ukrainian immigrants, and also very supportive of Ukraine. And some of this, I think, is part of it is kind of it goes back to history in the sense of Western Ukraine is sort of part of viewed as part of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and sort of part almost cousins to Poles, although there were many wars fought in history between Ukrainians and Poles, no question. But I think there's some sense of brotherhood with Ukrainians in Poland. Also, there's a large Ukrainian diaspora in Poland from earlier phases of the war between Russia and Ukraine, going back to for the last 10, 15 years, significant numbers of Ukrainians already in Poland. So and that's helped, I think, a lot of the Ukrainians you've come across, because I think in terms of, because significant language barriers for Ukrainian refugees in terms of getting jobs or going to school in other parts of Europe have been less severe in Poland, although they're there, but they're less severe in Poland because there are a significant number of Ukrainian speakers who live in Poland and have lived there for many years already. But what are the issues in Poland? I mean, certainly the Polish economy is teetering on the edge. It is a country of very high inflation. As I said, the Eurozone inflation rate is hovering around 10, 11% now. The Polish inflation rate is closer to 20%. And it has been for a while. Second thing is housing scarcity. So a huge driver of inflation in Poland is enormous housing scarcity. So really non-existent possibilities on the rental market, or they're very, very expensive. So supply and demand rules have kicked in significantly. So many of the Ukrainian refugees are still living in hotels, or they're living in people's houses, and have been for a long time. And I'm always reminded of the famous quote from Benjamin Franklin that guests, like fish, begin to smell after 3 days. Let's try 3 years. So that is an issue that is sort of a lingering challenge, I think, to Poland, and I think to other Western countries, is the housing crisis in terms of how long people are going to tolerate people living in their houses. And we're seeing this also in other places like the UK, which I'll get to in a moment. There are also, everything that I hear is just, while certainly it's true that the Polish healthcare system has accommodated the flood of Ukrainians, the other thing I do see is just how overwhelmed the system is, and it's sort of at that sort of saturation point, as is the Polish school system as well. Concerns about if there's another huge wave of refugees as a result of Putin's attacks on civilian infrastructure, whether that's going to really overtax the Polish system even more. I'll highlight a couple other countries. The Czech Republic, another one. 450,000 Ukrainian refugees have registered under temporary protection in the Czech Republic. It's the highest per capita number in Europe. The Prague population at some point, it actually rose by 7% during the refugee crisis. And there are similar issues that we're seeing in Poland. High inflation rate in the Czech Republic, housing stock hugely overwhelmed, including public housing as well as rentals. More than, the statistics I've seen from the UNHCR are about 50% of the Polish refugees the Ukrainian refugees in the Czech Republic are living in extraordinarily cramped conditions, not having to share bathrooms and things like that. So, but unlike in Poland, it seems like there is a bit more dissent in the Czech Republic with regard to the Ukrainian refugees, as well as the Ukrainian war situation, as well as there have been some pro-Russia demonstrations in the Czech Republic. So watch that space in terms of the stability of the Czech Republic's support for Ukraine and for Ukrainian refugees. Germany, I'll also highlight, about 1 million Ukrainians are in Germany, which is consistent certainly with the welcome culture of Germany, and also the history here of the 2015 Syrian refugee crisis, when 1 million people were allowed in. But certainly there are strains in Germany, as we saw after the Syrian crisis, although less so, I think, less political strain than we saw after the Syrian crisis, given, I think, just the ethnic issues that we see. But there certainly have been some pushback in Eastern Germany, in some of the areas like Cottbus and others that have been a center of right-wing populism, including the rise of the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland party, the right-wing party in Germany. So there's, but obviously Germany is a far wealthier country. Its inflation rate is closer to the 10% of the Eurozone rather than the 20% we're seeing in Eastern Europe. The other country I think I'll highlight just briefly is the United Kingdom, in the sense of the UK, obviously not part of the Eurozone, and famously not part of the European Union anymore after Brexit. But after the war, the United Kingdom enacted a policy or a scheme called the Homes for Ukrainians scheme, which has allowed over 100,000 people to come to the United Kingdom. And the reason I would highlight this is that under the Homes for Ukrainians scheme, essentially people in the UK were incentivized to allow Ukrainian refugees to live in their homes for a 6-month period. Well, for a lot of those people, that 6 months is up. And so the estimates are that as many as 14,000 Ukrainians may be homeless in the United Kingdom by Christmas. And the winter in the United Kingdom isn't exactly, it's not as cold as it is in Ukraine, but it's plenty cold. So there may be a homelessness crisis that's sort of on the rise in the United Kingdom and the numbers of sponsors who signed up in March of 2022 for this program, you're seeing numbers like in Leicestershire and other British towns and cities, people signing up at rates of like 10, 15%. So people aren't signing up for a second round in the program. So I think it's an indicator. It's just a small indicator, but it's an indicator of the rising, sort of slowly rising fatigue I think you're seeing in Western Europe with regard to the Ukrainian crisis. The last thing I guess I'll point out also is the United States. So the United States, obviously we're far away, and in the shift from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, I mean, Trump had essentially destroyed the U.S. refugee program and cut the refugee cap the United States takes of refugees down to around 10,000. Biden has put it back up to 125,000, which has been the historic level over the last 10 years or so. But we're getting nowhere near that level of refugees because of the bureaucratic processes that it takes to actually bring a refugee to the United States. Enormously complicated process. But the Biden administration pushed forward a program called Uniting for Ukraine that's sort of like the temporary protection directive of the European Union, of bypassing the refugee process and allowing people in essentially on humanitarian parole. And we've allowed about 100,000 Ukrainians into the United States under this program. It's not like the temporary protection directive in the sense that it comes with lots of benefits, but it does come with some. And also you need to have a sponsor in the United States to qualify for the program. But about 100,000 Ukrainians have come to the U.S. And it's fewer benefits than refugees or asylum seekers, but they have made them equivalent. The only key difference is that there's no path to a green card and for U.S. citizenship for people who come in under the United for Ukraine program. But certainly the United States taking 100,000 people, giving shelter, I think it probably, I mean, obviously the politics of the U.S. are poisonous, as I think the world is seeing how divided the U.S. is. But it also indicates that the United States is a country of immigrants and the size of the U.S., that the United States certainly could take more people. No question, to relieve, and as we could have during the Syrian crisis, but we didn't. And it's one where I think that we should be thinking about how the United States could up our participation in the effort to care for Ukrainian refugees. So I see I've been talking for a while. It's about 9:45. I just want to sort of sum up a few other key points, and then I'll open it up to. I see some good questions that are sort of arising in the chat. I think the key issues that I see, sort of big picture, is what's the morale in terms of the refugee crisis. Again, it's back to what's the morale of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian, and both in terms of the internally displaced people, but also the people who are not displaced in Ukraine, as to whether this escalation by Putin and the continued threats are going to drive President Zelensky to sort of feel like he has to go to the bargaining table and reach a deal with Putin that could conceivably give Putin a face-saving way out of this war that he's started and is losing, in a way that he can claim to the Russian people that he's gotten something out of the war. And so that's one huge question. And then the other key question, I think, as I've been highlighting in terms of going through these different countries in the West, is what's the staying power of the West? Not only the staying power of the West in terms of supporting the Ukrainian war effort with high-tech weaponry and others, but also in terms of supporting the Ukrainian economy, but also with regard to the Ukrainian refugee population that is still in Western Europe. And I do note that the Ukrainian government, once the attacks on infrastructure really got going, especially against power infrastructure and water infrastructure, the Ukrainian government has said to Ukrainian refugees who are in Western Europe, stay put, don't come back right now, because we do not want to overtax the tenuous hold that we have over electricity and power and energy and water in Ukraine. So please stay put in Western Europe. And so this is an interesting thing to say in the context of people who have been in Western Europe for 6 months already. And with, as I mentioned, the United Kingdom, I think that the mindset at the very beginning of the war is it's sort of like again, back to Lincoln and the second inaugural address and thinking about the U.S. Civil War. People thought that war was going to be quick too. be a quick victory, but it ended up being a long pitched battle. And I think, and same thing with World War I. And I think this is one of those key inflection points where I think we in the West, including the United States, have to start thinking about this refugee crisis, as being central to which direction this war goes, and also for the future of Europe, for the future of Ukraine, and for the Ukrainian people, but also thinking about this in terms of a longer term issue. This is not a short term issue that can be solved by things like the UK's Homes for Ukrainians program that will expire after 6 months. This is something where people are going to be in Western Europe for at least another year. And I see that the European Union recently extended its temporary protection directive to 2024. So that's a recognition there within the European Union. But I think all of us in the West, including the United States, have to view this challenge as a long-term challenge, and we have to shift our mentality from the short-term sort of focus that we've had and sort of thinking, well, okay, people are just going to be here for a little while, they're going to stay on our couches, we're going to have people live here for 6 months, we'll give them a little bit of help, but then people are going to leave, to more of a long-term sort of how are people going to live here in Western Europe. And also, and part of that is thinking about a different strategy, I think, not only in terms of housing security and stock, but also thinking about overwhelmed social services, whether it be healthcare or schools, but also crucially in the employment markets and in jobs. Because people, it's interesting thinking about in Poland, a little over half of the Ukrainian refugees are employed. Versus in France, which is a small player relatively, but 100,000 refugees in France, only about 15% of the refugees are employed. Now, why is that? Well, for one, thinking about the who's coming across the borders, it's mostly women and children because men are staying behind to fight the war. So if you're talking about women and children, number one concern here is childcare. How do people go to work and then care for their children? So childcare needs are paramount here in terms of allowing women to go to work, and others with children to go to work. And the second thing is the language challenge, is that it's not, obviously, time will tell as to whether the Eurozone slips into recession next year, but that's not the challenge right now. The challenge right now in Europe is inflation and energy costs, but there are ample jobs in Europe. There are jobs that people could take among the Ukrainians, but the challenges has been language difficulties, where in Poland it's easier because there are many more native Ukrainian speakers who are in Poland and have been there for 10 years or so. And are helping people assimilate, and there are robust NGOs that are helping teach language and others. But in France, there are not nearly as many language programs. Or it's Sweden, the Swedish programs that have given aid to the Ukrainian migrants. Number one, the amount of daily aid to people in Sweden is somewhere around, if I was doing my conversion of the Swedish kroner to the US dollar, somewhere around $6 a day is given to Ukrainian refugees in Sweden who were there under the temporary protection directive. That's obviously not nearly enough to live on. But also because under the temporary protection directive, unlike asylum seekers in Sweden who get access to language programs and quick immersion into learning Swedish, people there under the temporary protection directive do not have access to some of those programs. And I think that's also, it's part of the sort of short-term thinking, I think, that we've all had with regard to this conflict and with regard to the crisis of refugees coming across, that I think needs to shift that mindset into, this is going to be lasting for a while. People are going to be living in Western Europe and in the United States, Canada and Australia, other places for a good long time. And we need to prepare for that and give people the tools to succeed in our societies, including language skills, better job placement. And the last thing I'll mention is on the human rights side, and then I'll stop talking mercifully to people probably, is anytime you talk about huge movements of people in a conflict situation, you also have to think about crime and criminality and the threat to people in crime. And we've seen this in any number of conflicts, whether it be around the world, Syrian crisis, whatever else. And obviously a crucial piece of a crucial part of the crime that could be directed towards internally displaced, but also especially refugees, is human trafficking, and the threat of human trafficking as people are desperate for jobs, for language programs, for schools, for housing and other services, there's always the threat that people will be essentially duped into going to a program or going someplace where they could be kidnapped or brought into human trafficking. And that and the risks of that are severe here, not only because it's a risk, it's any kind of war situation, a displaced person situation, it's always severe, but also because before the war, I mean, certainly the long history of organized crime in Eastern Europe and also specifically in Ukraine and specifically related to human trafficking has been there. So, and certainly many of the online program platforms that have helped people get housing and jobs like Airbnb and other places have worked within relevant NGOs to become schooled and educated in terms of how you vet potential housing offers or how you vet job offers and others. But others are less schooled in that. And so it's a problem as we're thinking long term here, that we need to strengthen the relationships between the various online platforms and others that are helping people get jobs and housing, and the relationships between them and NGOs that are experts in human trafficking, as well as crucially law enforcement. So obviously European law enforcement, Europol and others, but also the United States too. My old agency, the Department of Homeland Security, is for whatever reason, forget the name of the agency, is actually one of the leading agencies of the U.S. government, including its law enforcement components, U.S. Immigration Customs Enforcement, ICE, and its investigative arm, Homeland Security Investigations, as well as Customs and Border Protection on the border side, are worldwide experts on human trafficking and have been working very closely with European authorities through attachés, and I know the attaché, the ICE attachés and the DHS attachés in Berlin and Warsaw and other places that are working closely with European authorities to combat crime, including human trafficking rings and human smuggling rings. So, but that is obviously, and when we think about human rights of refugees, that's another huge crisis and huge thing to think about and plan for as we think long-term and we shift towards a long-term mindset. Now, with that, I can see it's 9:55. I've filibustered for far too long. Let me open it up for questions.
I'm going to start with just a couple of questions and then we'll go through the chat. Thank you so much for that incredible overview of human rights and refugees. I really, really appreciate how you've underlined refugees as productive citizens. Right now I'm in Warsaw. I have a small child. Normally I would be working in Kyiv. I'm an American citizen observing things here. I've been here since January. And I think sometimes there is rhetoric in different parts of society, as I've observed also from the Polish government, as looking at refugees as helpless victims, especially women, thinking that women, cannot work because they have to take care of children. So I think some of, solving or looking at this as a problem also has a silver lining, because Poland had a huge labor shortage before the escalation of the war, and now there are 10,000 new businesses in Poland started by Ukrainian refugees. That's all going to contribute to the GDP and potentially building the approach as an ecosystem that has remittances going back into Ukraine. This can benefit Ukraine's GDP as well. I'm so glad too that you mentioned the IOM, because they're really one of the oldest and most trusted institutions in Ukraine that's been working with human trafficking for decades, and Ukraine has remained one of the top countries in the world dealing with this issue, which is a global issue, not only of Ukraine's own context. And I think as educators here, all of us have a lot to learn from you and your work in education and what we can take back to our institutions and to our students, so that we are addressing human trafficking and giving people the skills they need to protect themselves or to find active employment, so that we're not replicating the kind of guilt, shame, or blame around the topic, that it's not only, a crime, it's also a fact of humanity that's been going on for millennia, and we need to educate ourselves in our context, which now has social media and all of these different tools that can be operationalized to do harm. So Anyway, my question, I guess, is just more of a comment, but we can also follow up offline, and that is just toolkits for educators around human trafficking in Ukraine and beyond, that we can implement in our institutions. Where would you point us to?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, first off, before I get to that, I want to comment on your comment, which is, to heartily foot stomp everything that you're saying with regard to, number one, I mean, the Ukrainian refugees in Europe as well as in the United States, I mean, should not be viewed as a burden to society. I mean, these are people who are highly educated, can absolutely work, and many places are working in jobs well below their capabilities in terms of their education levels, in professions fundamentally. And in the United States, obviously, we have our mixed record with regard to how we view immigrants. And I think the lancet in the United States is that it's always, immigration is very popular in hindsight, but it's never popular when it happens. But the reality is, in the United States, obviously the US is a nation, as we call it, our nation of immigrants. US immigration has been the secret weapon of the United States in terms of our rising GDP over 200 and something years. The reality is immigration is almost always a net positive in terms of GDP, in terms of creating jobs and entrepreneurship and whatever else. So the question, though, I think to Europe and also to the United States is giving people the tools to succeed. Number one is language is a huge impediment, I think, to people getting jobs, and as to whether, as we think about next steps in Western Europe or in the United States, is immersion programs on key language skills to allow people to be able to succeed in jobs. And the second thing, I think, is this issue. Yes, I think absolutely. When thinking about women and children coming across the border into Western Europe with men fighting the war behind, yes, we focus on the vulnerability of people, but that's in some ways old thinking. It's very much old thinking in the sense of the key impediment to women working historically, at least, has been childcare, the lack of childcare. And we saw that in the United States as the pandemic was easing, as people were moving back. People were shocked that, well, why are people not going back into the workforce after the unemployment after the pandemic? Well, a lot of it was because of inadequate childcare resources. Is that, I mean, for a long period of time, we had parents that were at home with their children because their children were home from school on distance learning. How do you go back to work if your child is not in school or you don't have adequate access to childcare? And that's true of the Ukrainian refugees as well. I mean, in every survey that I've seen, from UNHCR to Pew Research to IOM to others, has said that those two issues are the key impediments to employment for Ukrainian refugees in Europe, which is the language difficulties and access to childcare. And so that seems to point a direction towards what we need to be doing in terms of thinking about long-term challenges here, in terms of how to allow people to stay and work productively in the West. Now, the third challenge on that, of course, is we want people to go home, not necessarily because we don't want people to stay in the West and become productive citizens in the West. That's great for the West, but it's not so good for Ukraine, because we actually want people to go home. We don't want to fulfill Putin's first strategy, which is to weaken the Ukrainian economy and its future by having a whole generation of Ukrainians leave Ukraine. We want to incentivize, and as we think long term in terms of the rebuilding of Ukraine and the somewhere between $300 billion to $1 trillion it's going to take to really rebuild Ukraine, probably more than that, we need to be thinking about ways to incentivize people to come back and actually rebuild Ukraine. And I think there's huge desire among the Ukrainian communities actually to go back as patriotic Ukrainians. But with regard to human trafficking, yeah, it's a massive problem. It's a massive problem. It's a massive problem for education as well, in the sense of in terms of educating people, certainly and also organizations and platforms, social media platforms and others, on what are the risk indicators of potential criminality and people trying to lure people into slavery and trafficking. I think there are a number of great NGOs that have been very, very helpful, especially in Poland and other places, in dealing with this challenge and working with platforms that are, and so many people obviously are getting jobs and housing through online platforms. And so the question is working with those platforms to make sure they're vetting the people who are actually posting on the platforms. and also close relationships with law enforcement. But yeah, the education community is certainly a big piece of the puzzle here. And you're right, it's not just Ukraine. There are worldwide lessons to be drawn here from other similar trafficking crises that have inevitably arisen when you have refugee flows at this scale. So yeah, we can certainly, I'd look forward to Jessica working with you offline.
Yeah, absolutely.
Together.
And in our Fulbright community, we have so many experts, including one law professor who is part of writing Ukraine's new constitution after the Revolution of Dignity between 1314. And I've had many conversations with him because he says he based a lot of it on the US Constitution. So as a member of the Supreme Court Bar, it would be my personal honor to introduce you to him.
I'd love to help on that. There's some some issues that the United States has faced with its constitution over the years, including right now. So we can steer them away from the words to the wise. But yeah, no, I'd love to help in that.
But yeah, Ukraine is, still going through the processes of the revolution as the war is taking place. So the mention of the Civil War, American Civil War, which we have so many questions, I don't want to keep talking, but mention is very apt, I think, because the war and the revolution seem to be taking place at the same time still in Ukraine. Yeah. It reminds one of early America in many ways in that sense. But,
well, one could make the argument that the Civil War hasn't really ended. What's the great line from William Faulkner? Is that the past isn't really ever past?
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's hope that the Gilded Age comes and is not mired in all of the problems that we had in the Gilded Age. But all of the good, as more people can have more equality in entering the civil service, women can vote, etc. But let's turn to some of the audience questions. Dmitry Kaminsky asks a golden question on the airwaves these days. What is your take on the potential for future negotiations between two sides? I'm assuming that's Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah. Well, I think it goes to, at what point do you want to negotiate? I mean, I think with Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainian army having significant gains, obviously in the east, and I think girding for the Battle of Kherson, I think it's going to come soon here in the south. I don't think that President Zelensky probably wants to come to the negotiating table right now. I think this is like again back to the U.S. Civil War. I don't know if people have seen the Steven Spielberg movie Lincoln, about Abraham Lincoln, in the sense of him holding the peace negotiators at bay in Richmond or in other places from the South, because he didn't want to have peace negotiations while there were continuing to be advances on the battlefield, and also before the 13th Amendment was passed. And I think Zelensky is probably trying to avoid negotiations as long as possible while his troops are on the move. And by the same token, so I think, because I don't think that Zelensky wants to be forced into a deal that would, in the interests of, forced by the West and others into a deal that would result in the loss of Ukrainian territory, especially territory gained by Putin after February 24th. I mean, certainly, and I think the other thing is, as also, I keep going back to the Civil War, is that war aims change as the war continues. And I think the war aims, the initial war aims of Ukraine and Zelensky were survival. Now I think the war aims have expanded to conceivably take back Crimea and take back all territories that have been conquered by the Russians in the last decade or two. So I think the question, yes, I mean, certainly everybody wants the killing to stop, but nobody wants Putin to be rewarded for this act of aggression. And especially given it's hard to say that we should just sort of find a deal and leave Russia in control of certain territories in Ukraine, because it rewards Putin, but also because we've seen the consequences of Russian occupation in Bucha and other places. That means we're basically condemning the populations of those regions to horrific oppression and death in certain circumstances. So I don't know.
And one could argue also that it's not only territory that would be negotiated, but also it's impossible to negotiate with an ideology that is imperialist colonialism, and you are the subject of that colonialism in the Ruski Mir. ideology.
Right,
It is
exactly.
assuming one cannot argue with it because it's like arguing from inside of a dragon's mouth.
Yeah.
Which brings me to the next question. Yana Chapailo asks, you've mentioned terrorizing Ukrainian people. How come the US still has not recognized Russian Federation as a state sponsor of terrorism? And how can we influence this decision academically and politically?
I mean, it's an excellent question. It's a political question, certainly in the United States, in terms of, and also I mean, I suppose there's also a broader doctrinal question in terms of what do we mean by terrorism. Now I'm getting into my law school class of terrorism and national security. How do we define terrorism? I mean, terrorism by definition, at least in international law and US law, is not necessarily state terrorism. It's sub-national terror, so like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and others. But the United States, in designating terrorist organizations, has breached that line recently, even through the recognition of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and also the Quds Force as terrorist organizations that are, even though they are branches of the Iranian military, Iranian government. So actually, we are speaking out of both sides of our mouth when we say, well, we can't recognize Russia as a terrorist state. I mean, I suppose they are supporting terrorism by hiring the Wagner Group and other sub-state actors, and certainly the Little Green Men in the Donbass over the last 10 years, arguably. But I'm speaking like a lawyer here. As a politician, a diplomat, I think the other problem here, I think, is I think this issue of, Russia's different because it's got tens of thousands of nuclear weapons or thousands of nuclear weapons. And I think the diplomatic consequences of naming Russia a state sponsor of terrorism in terms of how we get out of this war long term, in terms of how we normalize the Russian-US economic relationship, Russian-Western economic relationship, and then also as it relates to China. I think it's a complicated issue, but I agree with you that it is an issue that warrants a lot more discussion in the United States to think about. I mean, obviously, it also goes right to the heart of political differences in the U.S. because I think, as you're seeing, this is a weird war in the sense of, I think there's a significant and growing part of the Republican Party that is fundamentally pro-Russia. And it's a small party. It's the Marjorie Taylor Greene MAGA wing, but that wing is very powerful within the Republican Party. So it's also it would be a politically fraught decision, I think, to declare Russia a state sponsor of terror. I
wonder if there may be new terminology that we need to develop legally in order to encompass what's happening, because it seems unprecedented. It is to have a member of UN Security Council sourcing drones and, rattling the Cold War nuclear saber. So it could be that we are on the avant-garde of something that we need to.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think but it does remind me of, I agree with you in the sense of, but it's also, what's the line from, my history is from history of the Peloponnesian Wars, in the sense of the line from, what's one of the dialogues, just where the Athenians essentially obliterated a rebel colony, and essentially the line is the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. And I think that's the problem here, I think, with international relations with the Russians here, in the sense of, yes, of course, we should have a different conception of international relations and different conceptions of this kind of, it's not even state-sponsored terrorism, it is state terrorism, in the sense of by unleashing these Iranian drones on civilian populations, on cruise missile attacks and threatening nuclear war. I mean, this is more like Nazi-style state terrorism rather than state sponsoring other people terrorism. So it's almost like we're back to an earlier conception of international relations and international brutality. But the problem is the UN, Russia has a veto on the UN Security Council. So we can't kick Russia out of the Security Council because they veto it. So, and the last time they didn't show up for a Security Council meeting that allowed something to go through without their veto was the UN response to the Korean War. So they learned their lesson there. So I don't know how international law changes given the continued international legal power of Russia and China, for that matter, back Russia.
Mhm. Richard Arnold asks and comments, essentially, it seems to me Putin is Putin's, the West will fold before Russia does. The West will get tired of economic consequences of refugees and inflation sooner than Russia will. Yet the Russian economy is the size of Italy. And how do you evaluate the prospect of an internal coup in Russia?
So this is where it's interesting. I think right. That's the challenge here. That's the the hearts and minds challenge. Is do we get tired before the Russians collapse? And it's like the the calculus in the Vietnam War that Ho Chi Minh made, in the sense of we'll lose 1,000 people and the Americans will lose one, but in the end the Americans will get tired. I think the difference here is obviously we don't have troops on the ground. This isn't like the Vietnam War. I think certainly Putin is counting on the West losing its cohesion and losing it politically, as more political parties that are more inclined to support Russia come into power, conceivably, or at least share in power in the West. And as we get that kind of fatigue, it's a challenge. In terms of the chances of a Russian coup or what happens to the Russian economy, it's hard to say. I think in the intelligence business, the line is that there's a difference between puzzles and mysteries. We can solve the puzzle as to what's going on in the Russian economy, what's the unemployment rate, what's the price of fuel, whatever else, but we can't solve the mystery of what's going on in Putin's mind, and nor can we solve the mystery, which we don't know. It seems like Putin has this is like Khrushchev in 1962-64, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, where there was a committee of people at the top of the Soviet Union who could say to Khrushchev, after the mistake in the Cuban Missile Crisis, all right, it's time to go into quiet retirement and let Brezhnev take over. There isn't that kind of committee. There isn't that kind of, I think Putin has, what does he call it? The vertical of power. He's centralized power into himself, and he's isolated himself physically, I think, from people. So the question is whether anybody could get close to him to mount that kind of a coup. And I think the only people who conceivably could mount that probably would be the military, conceivably, if the military sees that the Russian army is fundamentally being destroyed in Ukraine, and at some point the Russian army and the career military of Russia have to see that this is becoming so disastrous to the Russian military that policy needs to shift and Putin needs to be removed. That's the hope. We'll see whether that would happen. As for the Russian economy, it's hard to say how impacted the Russian economy is, because the reality is, in some sense, the sanctions against Russia, especially the energy sanctions, have resulted in higher prices for fossil fuels. And that's something that Putin's friend in Riyadh, Mohammed bin Salman, has helped out as well by constricting Saudi production of oil as well. So Russia is benefiting from high oil and gas prices. Now he's selling also a lot of oil and gas to China at a steep discount, because the Chinese, I think, have basically said, yeah, we'll support you. We're not going to give you any weapons. Sorry, the recording. But certainly I think the result of the war might be that Russia becomes even more of an economic vassal of China. But you have also countries around the world that are continuing to buy Russian oil, including India. You saw that the election of Lula da Silva in Brazil. We'll see whether Brazil falls into civil war with Bolsonaro doing a Trump and trying to claim power. But one of the first things that new President Lula said was, that the Ukrainians and the Russians are equally responsible for this war, and they need to, Zelensky is just as responsible as Putin, which is shocking to hear, sort of thinking about what's actually going on, what actually has happened. But that's, that may be the view of a lot of people around the world. So I don't know whether necessarily Russia's economy is really on the ropes yet.
Anthony Potoczniak asks, thinking big picture from a legal perspective, how has or will the refugee crisis impact Ukraine's application and hopefully integration into the EU? For example, has temporary protection directives and other refugee programs increased or accelerated the integration process?
Don't think I think those are two totally different tracks in some ways. I think, the temporary protection directive, in terms of helping refugees that are on the ground in Europe, that's one thing in terms of having immediate help, which, as we've discussed, is arguably inadequate. It needs to be stepped up and strengthened in some crucial ways to help Ukrainians succeed while they live in the West. I think the question of European Union membership, though, I think is separate and more, arguably more of a political question. That yes, the presence of refugees in the West is a piece of that, and could, depending on refugee fatigue in the West, sort of drive some of that conversation. But I think there, as of now, I think there's significant support in Europe for considering Ukraine for European Union membership. And obviously that's been a movement that was in a lot of ways what the Revolution of Dignity was about too, in the sense of the desire of the Ukrainians to become a candidate for EU membership. But I would predict that actually over time that Ukraine will become a European Union member. I think that's an easier question. It's certainly an easier question than whether Ukraine will become a NATO member. I think that's far less likely, I think, especially, and certainly it won't happen while the war is going on. But the membership of the European Union, I think it strikes me as more likely, and I think will happen. I think it'll take some time, but I think it will happen.
It's interesting to think about how Ukraine unites the EU, actually, and what the EU imagines about itself shifts a lot, and also the US too.
Yeah.
How the US thinks about democracy and a lot of the values-driven components of the defense of Ukraine. And also, I've noticed in the recent Nobel Peace Prize, the Ukrainian people were part of that award. Many people in this audience are Ukrainian people, so they are recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize. But it's also an imaginary, it's an imagined community, as Benedict Anderson would say, that is co-imagined with the West, with the EU and the US, as much as it is also Ukrainian people. But I think it's important, to think historically, and Maria Kravchenko has a question on that line. She says, thank you for the great lecture. I've just finished a review on Watching Darkness Fall, FDR, His Ambassadors, and the Rise of Adolf Hitler by David McKean. And there was Breckinridge Long. He was the US ambassador in Rome and also a real fan of Mussolini during World War II. FDR gave him a job in Department of State, a high position connected with visas and migration, and he did everything he could to not accept millions of refugees from Europe to the US, including children. Eleanor Roosevelt called him a fascist. What could be done to prevent the spread of influence of Longs, people like Long, Putin and Russia's lovers in high political levels of the US?
My advice to the American people, as again citing history, is vote early and often. No, is to vote correctly in the sense of I think it's interesting. I'll put the two, Jessica, your comment and Maria's question together into one, which is to say, I think it is true that the Russia's invasion of Ukraine has united the West in a way that I have not seen united in a long time, in the sense of sort of waking us up, I think, to this struggle that we are facing between defending democracy and the liberal values that we have, including liberal values like LGBT rights and rights for women and separation of church and state, and all the kind of key liberal values, including democracy and equality for all, that we all have fought for in the past, and that are, in the United States as founding documents and whatever else, that I think have been put into question by this war. And I think it has united the West and woken us up to those kinds of values at the fundamental values level. However, those values are not universally shared, I think, in the West. And I think it's certainly, speaking for the United States, and this is sort of wandering into Maria's question, is there's a real battle in the United States. I think that's part of the polarization that we see. It's interesting. I don't know how many people have been watching the World Series in the United States or around the world. I don't know how many people would want to watch a Philadelphia versus Houston World Series, but go Phillies, although that's really more, I'm a Dodger fan, not a Philly fan, but anything but the Astros. But it's interesting, if you're watching the World Series, which is on Fox, one of the there was an ad during earlier on in early parts of the playoffs, that's as a group of people who put together these political ads, one that was just incredibly anti-immigrant, talking about immigrants coming across the Mexican border into the United States who were killing our children, and essentially that. And the people behind that it's a group that's led by Stephen Miller, who was the key advisor to Donald Trump on immigration, and he's the guy who was behind the child separation policy that was implemented at the U.S.-Mexico border by the Trump administration. He's the guy behind the dramatic decline in refugee admissions by the United States, and all these other things, because he's absolutely against immigration. And he also has produced another ad during the World Series that was essentially an ad talking about Russia and Ukraine being equivalently responsible for this war, and the corruption in Ukraine and all that. So I think there is a segment in the right wing in the United States that is, I think is wandering into fascism territory, as Eleanor Roosevelt would say, that is supporting authoritarianism, is actually questioning democracy. If you really, if you think that the 2020 election was fraudulent and Biden is an illegitimate president, you're saying that against all evidence, which means that you really do not support democracy. You support a kind of authoritarian rule. And I think there's a large part of the far right in the United States that is on that side, and is also, I think, on the side of Putin. I mean, you look at the various statements by Tucker Carlson, who's the leading commentator on Fox News, and actually arguably the leading, highest, watched person on TV at all, actually, in Tribune News, is Tucker Carlson. He's affirmatively pro-Putin. So I do think, Maria, that this is a question of I've never in the United States, I haven't seen a time where fundamental foreign policy questions, and also questions of values, including liberal values versus something else, whatever it is, have been in question so much. And it's interesting. I highly recommend, not to be the law professor here, but I highly recommend reading the new national security strategy that was just issued by the Biden administration, that talks about the threats facing the United States, including from Russia, but also China, but also very much puts it in the context of a broader ideological struggle between liberal democracy and authoritarianism. And it's really a galvanizing document. But you could also see, I don't think a document like that would be written by a government in power that includes a Tucker Carlson or a Stephen Miller. So it's really America, the United States is divided, I think, between in those questions. And so I think, as I said, I started my answer to your question, Maria, vote early and often, quoting Richard Daley, old mayor of Chicago, it's about who's in power, who wins these elections. And so the midterm elections here that we have next week are really important, because I think fundamental questions of values and U.S. foreign policy are on the ballot, as Barack Obama would say.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's interesting to think about the appeal from the other side. What is the appeal to authoritarianism and fascism? We know from Weimar Germany attracted a lot of people because people were very poor and insecure, and Hitler was to them a way out. I don't understand why in the US people are attracted to authoritarianism and following this kind of thread. I can only think or speculate on the emergence of new forms of media and rapid communication strategies that gain a lot of followers, and that authoritarianism, unlike liberalism, is a kind of very organized path to mass appeal that liberalism doesn't necessarily have. It's always been kind of fractured. That's the fault of the left, historic left anyway. Yeah. But in the new social media, the new age of information and big data and big tech, you can see there is also just a structural threat to liberal democracy that is not necessarily human driven only. I guess this is my man versus machine question, and may not have any answers today, but I'm wondering just more about the national security strategy in the context of big tech and regulation of information versus privacy rights. And I think that this is an area of law probably that is growing right now.
Yeah, it's a massive question. We should have another lecture on that. It's another huge issue, which I'm happy to do. Actually, literally just been teaching that issue to my law school class in terms of the rise of violent extremism of the kind that obviously resulted in it seems like the attempted assassination of Nancy Pelosi the other day. I think the rise of the right and the rise of fascism. I think social media has a huge part in it, in the sense of creating these echo chambers of algorithms that essentially drive content to people who want to hear that content. And so it creates these sort of information ecosystems of groupthink. And that's how, I think extremism gets rolling. I think the other thing is also so many of these far-right movements, whether it be in Europe or in the United States, are founded on a type of mythological nostalgia. And I think that's what fascism was founded on, Nazism was founded on. I don't mean to compare Make America Great Again, MAGA, to fascism, but I kind of do, in the sense of, I think Make America Great Again appeals to, I think, the same people who Viktor Orban, I think, resonates with in the United States, in the conservative community, of Orban's comment that Europe is a white Christian area. And I think there are a lot of people in the United States who long for the days of the 1950s, before the 1965 Immigration Act, before the Civil Rights Movement, before the Women's Rights Movement, where white men ruled the day. And there was less competition from people from all over the world, or from the other 50% of the population, i.e. women. And also there were, less recognition of, non-traditional values, in terms of LGBT rights. So I think it's cultural. I think it is sort of a nostalgia. It's, the death rattle of people who were in power and have been in power, and seeing their power slipping. And I think that's also, you could look at Brexit as through the same lens, that arguably Brexit was a primal scream of English nationalism. It's not British, it was English nationalism, and that's who voted for it, the English people in the countryside that voted for Brexit. And I think you could see that also in the National Rally in France and the AFD. And I mean, this is the blood and soil nationalism that's sort of this quasi-fascist, is looking back to the West as a white Christian area. That's motivating. I mean, it's interesting. There was and I see we were almost out of time, but there was a big rally in Pennsylvania a couple of weeks ago, the Reawaken America tour, with Michael Flynn and Eric Trump speaking. And it's basically, it was a white Christian rally, Christian nationalism rally. So I think that's a lot of what's sort of driving some of this. I think it was in the right wing, at least in the US.
I want to also make sure that I get to Renata Conrad's question, because it circles back to our headlining topic. She would like to know about current anti-trafficking efforts in Ukraine or abroad.
I'm less familiar with the anti-trafficking efforts that are happening inside Ukraine itself. More familiar with what's going on in Poland in terms of the NGOs and also the law enforcement authorities that are working on it. There are robust efforts to work with the platforms that are listing jobs and housing, and working in concert with NGOs and also with law enforcement on that. There are significant efforts on that. More needs to be done, though.
Any last questions in the audience? Anybody want to raise their hand or post a question? No, we are out of time. I would like to thank you, Seth Stodder, for joining us today. It has been such an eye-opening discussion. I have, so many follow-up questions that I would love to pick your brain on, and hopefully we will be able to bring you to Warsaw and Kyiv in person.
Love to.
Yes, and thank you, Maria Kravchenko, for organizing this and for your wonderful historical question as well. And to everybody here in our audience, thank you for joining us. Please note this is recorded, will go onto our YouTube. You can share it, retweet it, assign it to your students, teach your mother or your neighbor, and
I inflicted on my students as well.
Yeah, yes, that's great.
More than I'll inflict it on my children. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And we have also a presentation on November 9 with 4 panelists, 2 Ukrainians, 2 Americans, all of them experts on nuclear security, another very timely topic. Tune in for that, and we plan and hope to have many more lectures, so write to us with your ideas, or we will write to you, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jessica and Maria. Thank you for everyone. Good to really enjoy the conversation.
You as well. Na
Thank you.
dobranoc.
Yes.